Well, today we're going to be talking about Lochia, bovine Lochia in this case. So I could have titled it Lochia in cattle. And Lochia refers to that limited time after calving where there's a vaginal discharge of the debris that's left in the uterus after calving. And we'll see all this stuff. My name is Rod. And I've got some photos I took a number of years ago that are precious. You can't find them anyplace. When I was doing a lot of cattle research, Jim Callahan was helping me a lot. And he was terrific. He was a bovine theriogenologist that couldn't be matched. He was wonderful. He's left us now, but I'll tell you what, I think about him all the time. I drive near his house every once in a while on the way to the grocery store, and he taught me so much about bovine theriogenology. So, I'm going to give you a little preview of the presentation, kind of like to whet your appetite, maybe like an appetizer, I guess. I don't have everything listed here that I will be discussing, but I do want to give a definition for Lochia because it's rather contained to a certain period of time after calving. Then I'm going to talk about how if you look at Lochia, you really need to know how many days after calving was the cow that produced the Lochia. You need those two things because just looking at Lochia can lead you astray. Get a little talk about uterine involution, and I have some very unique pictures that you'll never see anyplace else. I guess this might be their premiere then. And I'll be talking about that. I have some pictures of normal Lochia, but then I have some pictures of the Lochia before it became Lochia. That means I've cut open a uterus and let the fluid flow out so you can see it before it makes the journey out through the vagina and vulva. And then some people might confuse some of the blood that appears on the vulva. They might confuse it with met-estrus bleeding, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit because some people don't know about it, especially with cattle. And I've got like a little myth that was going around years ago about met-estrus bleeding and artificial insemination, so we'll talk about that. But that's a little preview, but it doesn't have everything in it that I will be talking about. So now we're going to talk about the definition of Lochia. So the normal postpartum vaginal discharge that occurs during uterine involution. And so to set the stage, you know, the calves I'm going to talk about were about 80 pounds when they were born. But that leaves a pretty big uterus in place that they developed in for 280, 285 days. And so there's a discharge that has to occur to get the uterus healed up during involution so we can start another pregnancy. And for cattle, it's typically present, the Lochia now, up to 30 days postpartum, but you know that not every cow reads the textbook, so don't be surprised if there's some Lochia coming out of some cows 40 days, but for beef cattle, it should be ending around 30 days, and we'll talk about the progression of color of this stuff. And Lochia is a mixture of blood. I said also placental remnants. Most of the placenta has left, but there's some debris left over. And then uterine tissue, we're talking about caruncles, and I'll show you those. Some of that tissue has to slough off for healing. And then there's plenty of fluid, and my unique, one-of-a-kind photos will show you that. So I can't emphasize enough that when you're looking at Lochia, which is the vaginal discharge after calving, to really know what it's going to tell you, you have to know what day after calving the cow is. Because if some cow is 9 days after calving and presents a certain lochia, and then if the cow's 90 days after calving and presents the same looking discharge, I don't want to call it lochia now, but it's a vaginal discharge, then you're in trouble. Okay, so uterine involution refers to the reduction in size of the uterus after calving. And you know, if you try to palpate, rectally palpate a cow after calving 1 or 2 days, you can't even get a hold of the whole uterus. It's so big. But then it involutes, and it's amazing how fast this occurs. By a couple weeks to 17 days after calving, then you should be able to get a handle on the whole uterus via, I guess you could say, transrectal palpation. I've got pictures of these things that I took myself, and there's no guessing on the stage of postpartum because I was there every morning helping them calve. So I've got some, like I said, unique images of lochia and actually the uteruses that were taken, or I should say maybe uteri that were taken out of beef cows. So many of the images are mine. They weren't published anyplace because when I was taking the pictures of the uteri and the fluid in a dissected uterus, I was not thinking of making a video because the cows were part of a research study that we were taking out brain tissue. So we were concentrated more on the hypothalamus, the median eminence, and the pituitary gland, and looking at hormone content and release and receptors for like GnRH. And these pictures I took maybe for my own curiosity. So it was a beef cow research. All the cows were beef cow. Most of them were Herefords, maybe a few Angus. They were all multiparous. I'll define that at the very end. But very seldom will you ever see a cut lumen, a cut uterus that shows you the lumen 5 days after calving, for example. Those are unheard of. But I've got them. So with lochia, there's really 3 stages. Lochia rubra, that means red. So at first, the lochia is very red. Then it transitions into kind of a pinkish color, maybe a little brown, lochia serosa. And then at the end of the time that lochia is being expelled, it tends to be whitish. And so we have lochia alba, which means white. So it's this transition, and that's the normal, and it can't go backwards. It can't do anything but this progression. Rubra, serosa, albia. And then pretty soon after albia, maybe I would just say nothing. Now, since I don't know your background, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the normal cow uterus. This is a image of a normal cow uterus. My red laser is pointing here to cranial. Back down here is caudal. And we're looking at the dorsal surface of the uterus, the normal uterus, probably nulliparous. I'll define that later. So then this would be left. This would be right. Here's the left ovary with a big blister on it. That's the follicle, 1 egg in the follicle. And we know in cattle, when they're pre-ovulatory, they're about 2.5 centimeters in diameter before they rupture or ovulate. On the right ovary, I think I've got a little, an old CL here that's maybe not so old, but it's got to be getting close to the end of life because that follicle's over here is pretty big. So, and you know, cattle are basically single ovulators. They ovulate one at a time. And, you know, the ovaries don't alternate like 1, 2, 1, 2. They don't do that. There might be 2 successive ovulations over here, maybe not, who knows. But, and if we know, like in this case, if this follicle ovulates in the animal's bred, the pregnancy will develop in this left horn because the pregnancy has to develop mainly in the uterine horn ipsilateral to the ovulation. Okay, this picture, image, and then the next one are probably the golden images of this whole presentation. So pay attention. Here is the entire uterus taken out of one of our beef cattle at 5 days after calving. No one ever does this. This is very unique. Now, it's cow 56. And notice how when I wrote the 5, I kind of ran out of ink, so it's kind of faint. I'm pointing that out because the next slide will have that same number, but a little bit in a different orientation because I cut the uterus right here, and I wanted to show what the interior looked like of that uterus. And it's kind of neat. It's the same cow. So it's kind of like you're seeing the outside of the uterus, which we didn't weigh them, but that's a lot of weight right there. And then I'm going to cut into the side, and you're going to see all the fluid that's left over 5 days after calving. And then it becomes most of the lochia. Okay, pay attention. Here's the 5. See how faint that is? And there's the 6. The same cow we saw in the previous image, but now I've made an incision into the uterus, and look at the fluid. It's just flowing out. I can't stop it. And I probably overflowed the cart that this was in. Got a close-up picture, and then I want to talk about these two peanut-shaped structures, because now you remember the calf is gone, the placenta's gone. This is 5 days after calving, and there was no retained placenta. But these are structures that are found on the uterine wall, the interior wall, that attach to the placenta. And these are called caruncles. It's like spelling car that you drive in, and then uncle, but put them together. And we're going to see that. But look at this debris here. Look at this fluid, dark red. So that's Lochia ruba. Okay, now the cow that I showed you in the previous 2 images, I never saw her expel lochia because beef cattle are on pasture. You know, they're hard to get a picture of their rubra in this case. But this is a dairy cow that I was using on another research project. And I didn't have the exact number of days down when I took this picture, but I'm going to say this is 5 to 10 days postpartum. And look at all the lochia here. You can imagine that coming from that uterus that we saw before with all that dark blood in it. And so if you walk by this cow and you know it's 5 to 10 days postpartum, you don't even stop. I mean, I stopped to take a picture. But if this is 90 days after calving, then you've got huge problems. That's why you have to know the stage of after calving versus what you see. Okay, so now we've got cow 60. I took a picture of her uterus. It's not showing a lot, and I don't have a ruler. I, kick myself. I should have had a ruler here, but I don't, because remember, we were working more on the brain and dissecting the brain. And when I took these pictures, it was almost like an afterthought. The next picture shows you what the inside looks like at 10 days, but it's a different cow, but, she's still 10 days postpartum. Okay, so here's 43, cow number 43, different than the uterus we saw before, but the same stage of after calving. And you can see now we're drying up a little bit. We're still kind of dark red, so you would call this is going to become Lochia rubra, but it's drying up a little bit and the uterus is shrinking. This was an image I found. This is not mine, but the person that took this picture said, here's Lochia at 12 days postpartum, and it's in sawdust and stuff, so it gets a little dirty, but it's probably a dairy cow because, beef cows are out on pasture and it's hard to see their lochia. Okay, I know this is cow 35. I took this picture. She was 20 days postpartum. And now you can see the whole uterus, and you see the right side, because remember, this is dorsal, this is cranial, so this is left, this is right. The right uterine horn, we would call that, had the pregnancy because it's bigger than the left, and you can see, it looks like I'm circling this, the CL of pregnancy down here, because you know that if a cow ovulates on her right, the pregnancy has to occur in the right horn. There is no transuterine migration. And the other thing about it is, if you know there's a CL here on the right and you're doing embryo transfer, you have to put the embryo in the right horn. So you put the embryo ipsilateral to the CL. Okay, so now here's a cut section of a 20-day after calving uterus. I can't tell you if it was the same cow as we saw in just the previous image, but we're drying up. The cotyledons are really shrinking. So by day 20, it looks like the cotyledons might have returned back to their pre-pregnancy state. They're not really functional yet, but I mean, we've got good involution going on here. Okay, now these are two cows on our study. Cow number 5 here on the left, cow number 26 on the right. You can kind of see that for number 26 here, her pregnancy was in the left horn. And for number 5 over here on the left, you can see her pregnancy was probably in the right uterine horn. Although now we're coming back to 30 days now, and so uterine involution, at least grossly, is nearing completion. I do not have interior pictures of either of these uteruses. Now, I don't know the days postpartum of this Lochia that's displayed here because I did not take these pictures, but I just have the next couple images to show you what Lochia could look like. It could be abnormal, it could be normal. I just don't know because I have no idea of the stage of postpartumness. Two more images. I'm going to say these are both abnormal, but I'm not sure because this one over here on the right, it's kind of white. Maybe it's Lochia alba. I'm not sure. I don't have any history with this stuff. This is just two images I found. So I'm making a point here. I'm not going to say anything about it, but I will say these are both dairy cows because it's a lot easier to see Lochia from dairy cows. They're in a free stall. A lot of times it's banked towards the back, so there's going to be a natural gravity drain of the Lochia. Beef cattle are out on pasture. You may not see that at all out there in the pasture. And finally, one of my dairy cows on study. This was 40 plus days postpartum. There's a little bit left of the Lochia alba. But basically, if I walk by this cow, which I did, and I know she's more than 40 days postpartum, then I'm going to say, oh, everything's looking normal, and hopefully we can get her in heat pretty soon. Okay, this image shows some pictures from a German group, and they had an article that said they made Lochia color chart and for cattle. And when I saw that title, I thought, oh man, that's going to be really great. I wonder, how many pictures they have and so forth. And I was pretty much disappointed because up here in German it says days after calving, and this is normal cows and this is abnormal cows like metritis and so forth. But they didn't have many cows, so like between day 1 and 3, they took this picture of one of the cows, and then 4 to 8, and then 9 to 16. The progression is right, but as far as being a good color chart, it's not that useful, and so I was disappointed. Now, earlier, I said I was going to talk about med estrus bleeding, and this is way different than Lochia. This could be a nulliparous heifer that was in heat 3 days ago, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's thought to be the uterine lining shedding after heat disappears. The uterus was under estrogen influence, and there's a thought that there's a little blood shed by the uterus and makes this material, but I'm not going to call it Lochia because this is metaestrus bleeding. Now I like this image because it shows the metaestrus bleeding, and I mean look at how that's hanging in there. And this is mucus material that comes from the cervix mainly when the animal is in heat. And so I wanted to compare in heat, let's say that's day 0, and it looks like egg white, and if you pulled it off here you could throw it on a wall and it would stick. But then it transitions into a blood-tinged material, and that tells you that heat was 2 to 3 days before this. So if you didn't see this cow or heifer in heat, you can mark it on the calendar that she's going to be in heat again, maybe in 16, 17 days, because you missed the heat. And then the other thing, early in the AI era, that's artificial insemination, dairy farmers, if they had bred this animal and then saw this blood-tinged material, they thought the pregnancy would not be maintained if there was a pregnancy. And that's totally false. This red-tinged material, 2 to 3 days post-heat, is unrelated to if conception has occurred or not. But it's useful to say, oh, I missed heat, but now I know she's going to be in heat in, let's say 17 days or so. I'm going to watch her closer. If you see this clear, that means she's in heat. And of course, if you do AI, artificial insemination, and you can watch this animal closer and see if she's in heat, but you know what? If she has just gone out of heat within 6 hours, it's still a fine time to breed the heifer or cow, because fertility is still very high within about 6 hours after the end of heat. Now I mentioned caruncles, and so this is a bovine uterus that has been dissected, and one horn has been flattened out here, and each little button that I'm circling is one caruncle. They're a permanent part of the uterus, so when a calf is born, you can even see these caruncles, although they're going to be very, very tiny. And you can see they vary in size because they get bigger if they're close to the fetus or a good blood vessel. But if they're at the end of the placenta, then they're going to be very small. But remember, these are caruncles, so they're not part of the placenta, but it's where the placenta and the structures there are called cotyledons attach. And then you get a placentome. So that reminds me, I probably should add a couple more terms at the end here in case these are unfamiliar to you. I just included this one. This happens to be a sheep, so these are ovine caruncles. But notice they're kind of in rows. There's 4 rows here. This is a ovine uterus I dissected out. It was pregnant, although I took the picture, and there's ovaries over here, but I didn't have the fetuses here. I can't tell you what stage it was. It was long enough ago that I know I took the picture to show the rows of caruncles, but that's all I wanted to show. Okay, I'm trying to illustrate cotyledons, and that's a structure on the placenta that attached to the caruncle, and they grow together and grow in size together. So this one was attached, this cotyledon was attached to a specific caruncle. This one was too, and if you notice, the ones nearer the fetus are larger than the ones that are far away. I did not take this picture, but I wanted to show that. And then this picture opens a can of worms, because if this is a bull fetus and that's a female fetus, then we have problems. With this image, I'm trying to show the normal color of the endometrium in the cow or heifer. And this side that was been dissected open will show you the normal color. And it says endometrium in uterine horn. The endometrium is the lining of the uterus that's next to the open lumen. The myometrium is below this, and of course it's muscles. Well, lo and behold, there's an ovary here, and here's the oviduct. Look at how long that is. If you're an egg, which is the size of a period at the end of a sentence, that's a long journey from like here to there. And then this one says uterine body, and it's a little blurry because I blew it up. But this arrow is pointing out where this part of the uterus is not present. So any fluid that this uterus makes is enlarging this right uterine horn. This is the right, this is the left. And it brings up an interesting point. They're trying to point that out with this arrow. I wanted to just show the normal color, but it'll take 10 minutes to explain how this animal could always be in heat, but become pregnant on this side, but never become pregnant on that side. But even if this ovary grew the follicle, it would be in heat. But the problem with it is that the cell that's formed would last the length of a pregnancy. What a can of worms. Okay, so now I wanted to talk about Lochia in women, just to show you how refined that state of the art is for charts, and color. And so it's the same thing. It's the discharge, the vaginal discharge after giving birth to a baby in this case. Now, I'm not going to read all the details. You can read all the details if it's interesting to you. But the point is the progression or the transition of color is the exact same. You start out with dark red. You then transition to pink, maybe a little brownish pink. Then you transition to white. Remember, this is Lochia rubra. This is Lochia serosa. This is Lochia alba. Read it if you want. I'm moving on. Another table that talks about the progression, dark red. And I like this one because it's got the rubra, serosa, and alba spelled out. Pinkish brown, whitish yellow, how long it lasts, and what's in it. A lot of bits of fetal membranes. Meconium down here, if you see that, that's the fecal material, the first fecal material that's discharged from the baby in this case. Calves do it too. And you don't want them to expel the meconium, until they're born. Another chart. I just wanted to show you how wonderful the human medicine literature was for Lochia. Pause it and read if you want. I'm moving on. And finally, I thought this chart was great, this image, to show you uterine involution. And it's amazing how fast it goes. And it's important to stop bleeding and so forth. But again, you can pause it and read it. I'm moving on, but I just wanted to say these things are available to read, and they've done a great job. So a few conclusions. During the early postpartum period, the bovine uterus contains a lot of debris. If you don't believe me, go back to the 5-day postpartum pictures. The debris must be expelled. Some of the fluid would be reabsorbed, so those things are going on simultaneously. And it's amazing how much is expelled and reabsorbed by about 30 days after calving. The debris is termed lochia, but this is refined to just the material that comes from a pregnancy, just in the early postpartum period. The transition is from, red, dark red, then pinkish, then white, and that's the normal. And notice how we never really talked about abnormal lochia, because that's 5 hours of talking. Then when you evaluate lochia, it's important, of course, to know how many days have passed since calving, because what looks normal at 9 days would be terribly abnormal at 90 days. So with this screen, I wanted to show you some terms that I did use, but maybe I went too fast. So I think I showed you a bovine nulliparous uterus. Nulliparous means that animal has never given birth to offspring. So, if a calf is nulliparous, she's never had a calf. But if a pig is nulliparous, she's never had a litter. So you can't say, did not have an offspring. That's not probably good. This is never given birth to an offspring for that one. Primiparous is where the animal has had one pregnancy, whether it be single bearing like cattle or a litter of 15 like in swine. Primiparous, one pregnancy. Then multiparous is where the animal has had two or more pregnancies. And here's where you can't say have two or more offspring, because pigs, litter-bearing animals, always have two or more offspring during their first pregnancy. So you got to be careful. Don't say have two or more offspring. Well, that doesn't work for litter-bearing animals. So say have had two or more pregnancies. And then finally, the placentome is where you have a carbuncle and a cotyledon growing together, which they do. So I said a carbuncle cotyledon unit. There's maybe about 80 in a uterus, something like that. You can count them. People have weighed them. Remember, the bigger ones are nearer the fetus and a good blood supply. But this is where everything is exchanged by diffusion. Oxygen comes in through the placenta, and fetus takes the oxygen up through the umbilical cord and, supplies cells with oxygen, and all the waste products go out through the placenta and go across to the uterus. So I always say the placenta really acts as the lungs for the fetus, because they're not breathing. They're in an aqueous environment. So it's very interesting. But not all animals have the carbuncle cotyledon. For us, I can tell you, cattle have it, sheep have it, and goats. They all three look a little different. The structure is different. So you would be able to pick out a bovine carbuncle from a ovine carbuncle, and a caprine, that means goat. But the point is, it's the point of exchange. Horses don't have it. People don't have it. There's three main types of placentation, which is beyond us. So I'm going to stop there and show you my trained dog at the end. It's actually not my dog, but he's been doing this for years. I saw this dog years ago in this picture. I never met him personally, but I tell him great job. Okay, take care, everybody.